The corridors of St. Clair Memorial glittered with sterile light that night, the kind that made every sound echo. The roll of gurney wheels, the faint beeping of heart monitors, and the whisper of rain tapping against the glass. Inside room 407, Lydia Tito lay propped against crisp white pillows, her hands resting over the curve of her 8-month belly. A silver wedding band glinted weakly on her finger, though its promise had long turned hollow. Her husband, Adrian Voss, heir to a luxury real estate empire, had stopped visiting days ago. He claimed business emergencies, but everyone in the hospital knew better. The tabloids had already published the photos. Adrian in Monte Carlo, arm around a glamorous brunette with the kind of smile that meant danger. Her name was Vanessa Reed, the mistress who'd clawed her way into the spotlight and into Adrian's mind. Lydia had loved him once. She'd believed his warmth, his gentle promises, the world he'd built around her. But love, she learned, was fragile when mixed with greed. She'd stayed quiet through his temper, his absences, his cruelty, all for the child she carried. Her father, Brendan Tito, had warned her. A man who hides his temper behind money is the most dangerous kind, he'd said. She hadn't listened then. She wished she had now. Outside her door, a nurse paused, frowning at the stranger striding down the hall in red heels that clicked like gunshots against the tile. Vanessa. She wore a designer trench coat over a blood-red dress, perfume heavy enough to choke the air. In her hand, a small handbag swung like a weapon. "Miss, visiting hours are over," the nurse began. Vanessa smiled without warmth. "Oh, I'm family," she lied smoothly. Before the nurse could object, she slipped inside room 407 and shut the door. Lydia's eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dreaming. "Vanessa?" she whispered. The other woman's smile widened. "Hello, darling. You look delicate." Lydia's fingers tightened around the bedsheet. "What are you doing here?" "I came to finish what he started," Vanessa said softly. "Adrian wants this problem gone, and so do I." The first blow came quick, the metal edge of Vanessa's purse striking Lydia's cheek. The monitors screamed. Lydia tried to shield her stomach, gasping for help, but Vanessa's rage was a storm. It lasted seconds that felt like hours. Then, as footsteps thundered in the corridor, Vanessa fled, her coat swirling behind her like smoke. The door burst open. Nurses rushed in, followed by a tall figure in a dark suit, Brendan Tito. The billionaire industrialist, whose name commanded boardrooms and governments, froze at the sight of his daughter's bloodied face. The world around him fell silent. "Dad?" Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. "The baby." He took her trembling hand. "Hold on, sweetheart." "I'm here now." As doctors swarmed the room, Brendan's eyes burned with something colder than grief. Precision. He turned to the head nurse. "Find the woman who did this," he said, voice low, controlled, "and call security. No one leaves this hospital." Within minutes, surveillance footage confirmed it. Vanessa Reed, mistress of Adrian Voss, had assaulted a pregnant patient. The clip leaked online before dawn. But Brendan Tito didn't wait for the press. By sunrise, his lawyers had filed charges. By noon, every investor tied to Voss Enterprises was calling in panic. By evening, Adrian Voss's name had vanished from the city's financial boards. While Lydia underwent emergency surgery to save her child, Brendan orchestrated what the media would later call the fastest corporate collapse in New York history. Every property, every account, every deal Adrian had touched was frozen. Brendan's private investigators unearthed years of embezzlement, laundering, and blackmail, all quietly delivered to the district attorney's office. When Adrian finally appeared at the hospital, disheveled and pale, a wall of cameras met him. Reporters shouted, "Did your mistress attack your wife?" Is it true your father-in-law bankrupted you in a day?" He tried to push past them, but inside the lobby, Brendan Tito was waiting. Calm, impeccable, eyes like granite. "You hurt my daughter," Brendan said evenly, his voice carrying through the marble hall. "You endangered my grandchild. Now watch how a real man protects his family." Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but Brendan turned away. Behind him, police officers stepped forward with warrants in hand. The flash of cameras lit the scene like lightning. But what happens next will change everything. 3 years earlier, Lydia Tito had been the kind of woman people stopped to admire. Not because she was loud or flashy, but because she carried herself with quiet grace. The kind that came from being raised by a man who believed in dignity over display. Brendan Tito had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way out of poverty with steel will and sharper instincts. He'd given his daughter everything: education, opportunity, freedom. But most of all, he'd given her love. "Never settle for a man who doesn't see your worth," he'd told her once, over dinner in their penthouse overlooking the city. "You're not a prize to be won. You're a partner to be honored." Lydia had believed him. She'd believed in love, in goodness, in the idea that people could be better than their worst impulses. Then she met Adrian Voss. It was at a charity gala, one of those glittering affairs where champagne flowed like water and everyone wore their wealth like armor. Adrian had approached her with a smile that seemed genuine, eyes that seemed kind. He was handsome in that polished, effortless way, dark hair swept back, tailored suit, a voice that made promises sound like poetry. "You're Brendan Tito's daughter," he'd said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," she'd replied, smiling. "Better than good. They say you're the only person in this city who doesn't care about money." She'd laughed. "I care about what money can do." There's a difference. He'd been charmed, or so it seemed. They dated for 6 months before he proposed. A private moment on a rooftop garden, the city lights spread below them like stars. Lydia had said yes, not because of his wealth or his name, but because she believed he loved her. Brendan had been cautious. "I've looked into his family," he'd said quietly, the night before the wedding. "The Voss empire is built on real estate, but there are gaps. Deals that don't add up. Money that moves in strange ways." "Dad, you're being paranoid," Lydia had said, squeezing his hand. "Adrian's not his father. He's different." Brendan had nodded, but his eyes had stayed dark. "I hope you're right, sweetheart. But if you ever need me, for anything, I'm one call away." She'd hugged him tight. "I know." The wedding had been beautiful. A cathedral filled with white roses, a reception that lasted until dawn. Adrian had whispered vows that made her cry, and for a while, Lydia believed she'd found her forever. But forever, she learned, was a word men used when they wanted something. The first crack appeared 3 months into the marriage. Adrian had come home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. When she'd asked, he'd laughed it off. "Client dinner," he'd said. "You know how it is." She'd wanted to believe him. The second crack came when she found the credit card statements. Charges at hotels she'd never visited, restaurants she'd never been to, jewelry she'd never received. When she confronted him, his face had gone cold. "You're being paranoid," he'd said, echoing her own words back at her. "Do you really think I'd cheat on you?" "I don't know what to think," she'd whispered. "Then maybe you should trust me," he'd snapped. "Or is that too much to ask?" She'd apologized. She hated herself for it, but she had. The third crack came when she got pregnant. She'd been so happy, so full of hope. She'd imagined Adrian's face when she told him, imagined him holding their child, imagined a future filled with laughter and love. Instead, he'd gone pale. "Are you sure?" he'd asked. "Yes," she'd said, smiling through tears. We're going to be parents. He'd forced a smile, but it hadn't reached his eyes. That's great. Really great. But after that night, he'd started pulling away. Late nights became all-nighters. Business trips stretched into weeks. Phone calls went unanswered. And when he was home, he was distant, cold, like a stranger wearing her husband's face. Lydia had tried to reach him. She'd cooked his favorite meals, planned quiet evenings, asked what was wrong. But every attempt was met with irritation, with excuses, with walls she couldn't climb. "I'm fine," he'd say. "Just stressed." You wouldn't understand. She'd stopped asking. By her 7th month, she'd moved into the guest room. By her 8th, she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring to bed. And when the tabloid photos surfaced, Adrian and Vanessa laughing on a yacht, kissing under Mediterranean stars, Lydia hadn't even cried. She'd just called her father. "I need you," she'd whispered into the phone, voice breaking. Brendan had arrived within the hour. He'd found her sitting on the edge of the bed, hands folded over her belly, staring at nothing. He'd sat beside her, silent, waiting. "I was wrong," she'd finally said. "You were right about him." "It doesn't matter who was right," Brendan had replied gently. "What matters is what happens next." "I don't know what to do." "You don't have to know yet." "But you're not alone, Lydia. You never will be." She'd leaned into him, and for the first time in months, she'd felt safe. But safety, she would soon learn, was an illusion. Because 2 weeks later, Vanessa Reed walked into her hospital room with murder in her eyes. The rain had started just after midnight, a soft patter that grew into a roar by the time Vanessa Reed's car pulled into the hospital parking lot. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the building's glowing windows, her fingers drumming against the leather steering wheel. Adrian had called her 3 times that evening. Each time, his voice had been tighter, more desperate. "She's going to ruin everything," he'd said. "The baby, the inheritance, the prenup. It's all going to come out. My father's lawyers are already circling." "So, what do you want me to do?" Vanessa had asked, though she already knew. "I need her gone," Adrian had whispered. "Not dead. Just scared enough to leave, to sign the papers, to disappear." Vanessa had smiled into the phone. "You want me to do your dirty work? I'll make it worth your while. You always say that. This time I mean it. Once she's out of the picture, we can be together, publicly, no more hiding." Vanessa had hung up without answering, but she'd gotten dressed anyway. The red dress Adrian liked, the heels that made her feel powerful, the coat that made her look untouchable. She wasn't doing this for him. Not really. She was doing it because Lydia Tito represented everything Vanessa had never been. Loved, protected, chosen. And Vanessa had spent her whole life clawing for scraps while women like Lydia were handed kingdoms. Tonight, that would change. She walked through the hospital lobby with the confidence of someone who belonged. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. She was beautiful, well-dressed, and smiling. That was enough. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt endless. Her heart pounded, but not from fear, from anticipation. When she reached room 407, she paused outside the door, listening. Inside, she could hear the faint beep of monitors, the rustle of sheets. Lydia was alone. Perfect. Vanessa pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lydia's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her face. "Vanessa?" she whispered, voice hoarse. "What are you—" "Shh," Vanessa said softly, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." Lydia tried to sit up, but her body was heavy, exhausted. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," Vanessa replied, moving closer. "You should have left when you had the chance." "What are you talking about?" Vanessa's smile was sharp. "Adrian doesn't want you anymore, Lydia. He hasn't for a long time. And that baby? She gestured at Lydia's belly. It's just a complication. A mistake. Lydia's hands moved protectively over her stomach. Get out. Or what? Vanessa laughed. You'll call for help? You'll tell your daddy? You're pathetic. Leave, Lydia said again, louder this time. But Vanessa didn't leave. Instead, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Adrian wanted me to give you this. Divorce papers, sign them, and we'll leave you alone. Refuse, and things get complicated. Lydia stared at the paper, then at Vanessa. You think I'm afraid of you? You should be. I'm not signing anything. Vanessa's expression darkened. Wrong answer. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Vanessa's hand swung out, the metal clasp of her handbag catching Lydia across the cheek. Lydia gasped, pain exploding through her skull. She tried to scream, but Vanessa's hand clamped over her mouth. Shut up, Vanessa hissed. Shut up, or I'll make this worse. Lydia thrashed, trying to reach the call button, but Vanessa knocked it away. The monitors began to wail, alarms shrieking through the room. Vanessa struck again, this time aiming for Lydia's ribs, her arms, anywhere she could reach. You think you're special? Vanessa spat. You think you deserve him? You're nothing. Just another spoiled little girl who got everything handed to her. Lydia's vision blurred. She could taste blood. Her hands clutched her belly, trying to shield the life inside her, but the blows kept coming. Then suddenly, voices, footsteps. The door burst open. Vanessa froze, eyes wide. For a split second, she looked almost human, scared, uncertain. Then she turned and ran, her red heels clicking against the tile as she disappeared down the corridor. Nurses flooded the room, their hands gentle but urgent as they checked Lydia's vitals, called for doctors, tried to stop the bleeding. Lydia's vision swam. She could hear voices, but they sounded far away. Stay with us, Lydia. We need to get her to surgery. Where's the father? Someone call her family. And then, through the chaos, a voice she knew, deep, steady, unbreakable. Lydia. She turned her head, and there he was. Brendan Tito standing in the doorway, his face carved from stone. He moved through the crowd of nurses like a force of nature, his hand finding hers. Dad, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The baby. I know, he said quietly. I'm here now. You're going to be okay. But even as he said it, his eyes were already calculating, already planning. He turned to the head nurse. Who did this? A woman, the nurse said, voice shaking. She ran before we could stop her. Find her, Brendan said, his voice cold as winter. And call security. No one leaves this hospital. Within minutes, the footage was pulled. Vanessa Reed, clear as day, entering the room, striking Lydia, fleeing. Brendan watched the video once. That was all he needed. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Marcus, he said quietly, I need everything you have on Vanessa Reed. And I need it now. On the other end, his head of security didn't ask questions. Consider it done. Brendan hung up and looked back at his daughter, now being wheeled toward the operating room. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, but she was breathing, fighting. He followed the gurney down the hall, his hand never leaving hers. You're going to be okay, he whispered again. And the people who did this? They're going to pay. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And Brendan Tito always kept his promises. The operating room doors swung shut, and Brendan Tito stood alone in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Around him, the hospital moved in controlled chaos. Nurses rushing past, doctors conferring in low voices, machines beeping their mechanical hymns. But Brendan heard none of it. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating, strategizing, preparing for war. He walked to the waiting area and sat down, his posture perfect despite the exhaustion pulling at his bones. He was 62 years old, but he'd built an empire on the principle that weakness was a choice. And tonight, he chose steel. His phone buzzed. Marcus Chen, his head of security and the closest thing he had to a friend. "Talk to me," Brendan said. "Vanessa Reed, 29, former model, current socialite. She's been Adrian Voss's mistress for approximately 18 months. No criminal record, but plenty of debts. Credit cards maxed out, rent 3 months overdue. She's been living off Adrian's money." Motive? Desperation. And probably a promise from Adrian that once Lydia was out of the picture, she'd be the new Mrs. Voss. Brendan's jaw tightened. Where is she now? Her apartment in Tribeca. We have eyes on the building. She hasn't left. Good. Keep her there. I want to know everyone she calls, everyone she sees. And Marcus? Yes, sir? Find out if Adrian knew about this. I want phone records, text messages, emails, everything. Already on it. Brendan hung up and closed his eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel it. The rage, the grief, the helplessness of watching his daughter suffer. Then he locked it away, deep in the vault where he kept all the things that could make him weak. When he opened his eyes again, he was Brendan Tito, billionaire industrialist, the man who'd turned a single construction company into a global conglomerate, the man who'd negotiated with presidents and stared down corporate raiders, the man who protected his family at any cost. He made another call. "David, it's Brendan. I need you at St. Clair Memorial. Now." David Huang was the best attorney in New York, possibly the country. He'd represented Brendan through hostile takeovers, regulatory battles, and one particularly nasty divorce case involving a business partner. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly loyal. "What happened?" David asked, already moving. Brendan could hear the jingle of car keys in the background. "My daughter was assaulted. The attacker is Adrian Voss's mistress. I want charges filed within the hour. Assault and battery? For starters. But I want more. I want attempted murder. Assault of a pregnant woman. Conspiracy. Whatever you can make stick. Do we have evidence? Hospital surveillance. Witness statements. And by morning, we'll have a full confession." David paused. "Brendan, you can't—" "I'm not going to touch her," Brendan said calmly. "I don't need to. Fear will do the work for me." "Understood. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Brendan hung up and stood, pacing the hallway like a caged predator. His mind was already moving to the next phase. Vanessa was the weapon, but Adrian was the hand that wielded it. And Brendan intended to sever both. He pulled up his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in years. Richard Voss, Adrian's father. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Brendan?" "It's 2 in the morning. Your son's mistress just put my daughter in the hospital," Brendan said without preamble. "She's 8 months pregnant. The baby might not survive." Silence. Then, "What?" "You heard me. And unless you want your family name dragged through every courtroom and newspaper in this city, you're going to help me destroy him." "Adrian wouldn't—" "He did. And you know it. You've been covering for him his whole life. The gambling debts, the embezzlement, the affairs. But this time, Richard, there's no cover big enough." Another pause. Brendan could hear the older man breathing, could almost see him calculating the damage. "What do you want?" Richard finally asked. "I want him out. Out of your company, out of my daughter's life, out of this city. And I want every asset he has frozen until the courts decide how much he owes her." "It's not negotiable," Brendan interrupted. "You have until sunrise to make it happen. Or I go public with everything Marcus has dug up on your company. And trust me, Richard, you don't want that." He hung up before the other man could respond. Brendan knew Richard Voss. They'd done business together years ago, back when both their empires were still growing. Richard was a pragmatist, a survivor. He'd sacrifice his son to save the family name without a second thought, and that was exactly what Brendan was counting on. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Marcus. Adrian just tried to board a flight to London. We stopped him at the gate. He's on his way to the hospital now. Brendan smiled, cold and sharp. Perfect. Let him come. 20 minutes later, David Huang arrived, briefcase in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a boardroom instead of his bed. "Fill me in," he said. Brendan did, his voice calm and precise. David listened, taking notes, asking questions. By the time Brendan finished, David was already drafting motions on his tablet. "We'll file criminal charges first thing in the morning," David said. "Assault, battery, attempted murder. With the surveillance footage and witness statements, we have a solid case. As for Adrian, we can pursue civil charges. Emotional distress, conspiracy, negligence. We can also freeze his assets pending the outcome of the divorce." "How long? To freeze the assets?" "A few hours if we move fast. To finalize the divorce? Months, maybe a year. But we can make his life hell in the meantime." "Good. Do it." David nodded and stepped away to make calls. Brendan returned to his vigil outside the operating room. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Doctors conferred in hushed tones. And through it all, Brendan sat, silent and still, a statue carved from resolve. Finally, just before dawn, the doors opened. A surgeon emerged, pulling off her mask. She looked tired but calm. "Mr. Tito?" Brendan stood. "How is she?" "Stable. She has a concussion, bruised ribs, and some internal bleeding, but we were able to stop it. She's going to be okay." "And the baby?" The surgeon smiled. "Your grandson is in the NICU. He's premature but strong. We're monitoring him closely, but I'm optimistic. Brendan's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the back of a chair, steadying himself. "Can I see them?" "Lydia's still unconscious, but you can sit with her. And we can take you to the NICU in a few minutes." "Thank you," Brendan said, his voice rough. He followed the surgeon to Lydia's room. She lay in the bed, pale and still, machines beeping softly around her. Brendan pulled a chair close and took her hand. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered. "You and the baby. You're both fighters." Her fingers twitched, just slightly, as if she could hear him. Brendan sat there for a long time, holding her hand, watching her breathe. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, he made a silent vow. "No one hurts my family," and walks away. Not Vanessa. Not Adrian. Not anyone. And before this was over, the whole city would know it. By the time the sun rose over New York City, Brendan Tito had already set the first domino in motion. He stood in the hospital's executive conference room, which the administration had graciously offered him after a single phone call. The room overlooked the city, glass walls framing the skyline like a painting. But Brendan wasn't admiring the view. He was building a war room. Marcus Chen arrived first, carrying a leather folder thick with documents. He set it on the table without a word. David Huang came next, followed by 2 junior associates carrying laptops and legal pads. And finally, Patricia Reeves, Brendan's chief financial officer, and the woman who'd helped him navigate 3 recessions and a dozen corporate battles. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What's the target?" she asked, sitting down. "Adrian Voss," Brendan said. "I want him financially destroyed by the end of the week." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary." Marcus opened the folder and spread documents across the table. "Here's what we have. Adrian Voss is the heir to Voss Enterprises, a luxury real estate firm worth approximately $2 billion. But he's not as secure as he looks. His father, Richard, still controls the majority of the company. Adrian has a seat on the board and access to certain accounts, but he's essentially on an allowance. How much? Brendan asked. 10 million a year plus bonuses, but he's been spending well beyond that. We found evidence of gambling debts totaling 3 million, undisclosed loans from offshore accounts, and payments to Vanessa Reed totaling over $500,000 in the past year alone. David leaned forward. If we can prove he's been embezzling from the company to fund his lifestyle, we can get him removed from the board and cut off from the family money. Can we prove it? Brendan asked. Marcus nodded. We have bank statements, wire transfers, and emails. He's been sloppy, arrogant. He didn't think anyone would look. Good. What else? Patricia pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Voss Enterprises has several major projects in development. A luxury hotel in Miami, a residential tower in Los Angeles, and a mixed-use complex here in Manhattan. All three are heavily leveraged. If we can spook the investors, the whole house of cards collapses. How do we spook them? Leak the embezzlement story. Suggest that Adrian's been mismanaging funds. Investors hate uncertainty. They'll pull out faster than you can say bankruptcy. Brendan smiled, cold and precise. Do it. David cleared his throat. There's also the matter of the prenup. Lydia signed one before the marriage, but it has a clause that voids the agreement in cases of infidelity or abuse. With the hospital records and the surveillance footage, we can argue both. Meaning Lydia is entitled to half of Adrian's personal assets plus alimony and child support. We're talking tens of millions. File the motion today. Already drafted. Brendan turned to Marcus. What about Vanessa? She's still in her apartment. We've been monitoring her phone. She's made 6 calls in the past 3 hours, all to Adrian. He's not answering. Because he knows she's a liability, Brendan said. He'll throw her under the bus to save himself. Probably, but she doesn't know that yet. If we move fast, we can use her panic against her. How? Marcus pulled out his phone and played a recording. Vanessa's voice, shrill and desperate. Adrian, pick up! They're going to find me. You said you'd protect me? You promised. Brendan listened, expressionless. Send that to the DA's office. Let them know she's willing to talk. You think she'll flip? I think she's terrified. And terrified people make mistakes. David made a note. If she confesses and implicates Adrian, we can add conspiracy charges. That's a felony. He could face prison time. Good. Patricia closed her laptop. Brendan, you realize this is going to get ugly. The press will have a field day. Lydia's name will be everywhere. I know. And you're okay with that? Brendan's eyes were hard. My daughter is lying in a hospital bed because of these people. Her son is fighting for his life in the NICU. I don't care about the press. I care about justice. Patricia nodded. Then let's get to work. For the next 6 hours, Brendan's team moved with surgical precision. David filed motions in family court, requesting an emergency restraining order against Adrian and freezing his access to joint accounts. He also filed criminal complaints on behalf of Lydia, citing assault, conspiracy, and emotional distress. Patricia contacted every major investor in Voss Enterprises, subtly suggesting that Adrian's financial mismanagement posed a risk to their portfolios. By noon, 3 investors had requested emergency meetings with Richard Voss. Marcus coordinated with the NYPD, providing them with surveillance footage, witness statements, and phone records. By early afternoon, a warrant had been issued for Vanessa Reed's arrest. And Brendan? He made calls. Quiet, careful calls to people who owed him favors. Journalists who'd covered his business deals. Lawyers who'd worked with him on past cases. Investors who trusted his judgment. He didn't lie. He didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth. Adrian Voss had endangered a pregnant woman, and his mistress had put her in the hospital. The story wrote itself. By evening, the first headlines appeared online. Billionaire heiress attacked in hospital. Husband's mistress arrested. Voss Enterprises heir. Accused of embezzlement and conspiracy. Pregnant woman fights for life after brutal assault. The articles were careful, citing anonymous sources and pending investigations, but the damage was done. Within hours, Adrian's name was trending on social media. Photos of him and Vanessa in Monte Carlo were shared thousands of times, accompanied by outrage and condemnation. Brendan watched it all unfold from the hospital, his expression unreadable. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Vanessa's been arrested. She's being held without bail. Has she said anything? Not yet. But her lawyer's already talking about a plea deal. Let her talk. The more she says, the worse it gets for Adrian. Marcus hesitated. Brendan, there's something else. Richard Voss called. He wants to meet. When? Tonight. He's on his way here. Brendan nodded. Good. Let him come. An hour later, Richard Voss arrived at the hospital, flanked by 2 lawyers. He was a tall man, silver-haired and imposing, but tonight he looked diminished, tired. Brendan met him in the conference room. They stood on opposite sides of the table, 2 titans facing off. You've destroyed my son, Richard said quietly. Your son destroyed himself, Brendan replied. I just made sure everyone knew about it. He made mistakes, but he doesn't deserve this. He put my daughter in the hospital. He endangered my grandson. What did you think I was going to do? Shake his hand and move on? Richard's jaw tightened. What do you want, Brendan? I want him gone. Out of your company. Out of Lydia's life. And I want him to pay for what he's done. He'll lose everything. He should. Richard stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed, the fight draining out of him. Fine. I'll remove him from the board. He'll have no access to company funds. But I can't control the courts. You don't need to. The courts will do their job. Richard nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About Lydia. About all of this. Save your apologies, Brendan said. They won't change anything. Richard turned to leave, then paused. You know, I always respected you, Brendan. You built something real, something that mattered. I wish my son had learned that lesson. So do I, Brendan said quietly. After Richard left, Brendan returned to Lydia's room. She was awake now, her eyes open but distant. When she saw him, she tried to smile. Hey, Dad, she whispered. Hey, sweetheart. He sat beside her, taking her hand. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck. Close enough. She closed her eyes. Is the baby okay? He's perfect. Strong. Just like his mom. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I was so scared. I know, but it's over now. You're safe. And the people who did this, they're going to pay. Adrian? He's finished. His career, his reputation, his money, all of it. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't want revenge, Dad. I just want to move on. I know, Brendan said gently. But sometimes moving on means making sure the people who hurt you can't hurt anyone else. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You really think this will help? I think it's the right thing to do. She nodded, too tired to argue. Okay. I trust you. Brendan squeezed her hand. Get some rest. I'll be here when you wake up. As she drifted off to sleep, Brendan sat in the dim light, watching over her. Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent to the battles fought in its shadows. But Brendan wasn't indifferent. He was a father. And he would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt his family again. The arrest came 3 days later, just as Adrian Voss was leaving his penthouse apartment in Midtown. He'd spent the past 72 hours in a haze of panic and denial, watching his life unravel in real time. His father had cut him off, His bank accounts were frozen. His face was plastered across every news site and tabloid in the city, accompanied by words like embezzlement, conspiracy, and assault. He'd tried calling Vanessa, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He'd tried calling his lawyers, but they'd stopped returning his messages after the third retainer check bounced. He was alone. Truly, utterly alone. And now, as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he found himself surrounded by police officers, their badges glinting in the morning sun. "Adrian Voss?" one of them said. "Yes," Adrian replied, his voice hoarse. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, embezzlement, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The words blurred together. Adrian felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists, felt the eyes of passers-by burning into him. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you order the attack on your wife? Is it true you've been stealing from your own company? Do you have anything to say to Lydia Tito?" Adrian said nothing. He couldn't. His throat was closed, his mind blank. They led him to a police car and pushed him into the back seat. As the car pulled away, Adrian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Pale, hollow-eyed, broken. He barely recognized himself. At the precinct, they processed him like any other criminal. Fingerprints. Mugshot. A small, cold cell with a metal bench and a flickering light. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Adrian couldn't tell any more. Finally, a detective came to see him. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Voss," she said, sitting across from him, "I'm Detective Laura Brennan. I'd like to ask you a few questions." "I want a lawyer," Adrian said automatically. "That's your right. But I should tell you, your girlfriend's already talking." "Vanessa Reed. She's been very cooperative." Adrian's blood ran cold. "What did she say?" "She said you asked her to scare your wife. To make her sign the divorce papers. She said you promised her money, a future together, all of it. And when things went wrong, you stopped answering her calls." "That's not true, isn't it?" Detective Brennan leaned forward. "We have phone records, Mr. Voss. Text messages, emails. We know you've been in contact with Vanessa for months. We know you've been funneling money to her, and we know you were desperate to get out of your marriage." "I didn't tell her to hurt Lydia," Adrian said, his voice rising. "I just wanted her to talk to her, to convince her to leave. And when talking didn't work, Vanessa decided to use her fists. Is that what you're saying? I didn't know she was going to do that. But you knew she was unstable. You knew she was capable of violence, and you sent her anyway." Adrian opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing he could say, nothing that would make this better. Detective Brennan stood. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Voss. You're going to be charged with conspiracy to commit assault. If the DA's office decides to pursue it, you could also face charges of embezzlement and fraud. And if your wife's baby suffers any long-term effects from this attack, you could be looking at attempted murder." "This is insane," Adrian whispered. "No," Detective Brennan said coldly. "This is justice." She left him alone in the cell, and Adrian sank onto the bench, his head in his hands. How had it come to this? He thought back to the beginning, to the moment he'd first seen Lydia at that charity gala. She'd been so beautiful, so kind. He'd genuinely liked her, maybe even loved her in his own way. But love, he'd learned, wasn't enough. Not when you were drowning in debt. Not when your father was breathing down your neck, demanding results. Not when every day felt like a performance you were failing. Vanessa had been an escape, a distraction, someone who didn't expect him to be perfect, who didn't care about his failures. But somewhere along the way, the distraction had become a trap. And now, he was paying the price. The arraignment happened 2 days later. Adrian stood before the judge, flanked by a public defender who looked barely out of law school. The courtroom was packed, journalists, spectators, and in the back row, Brendan Tito, watching with cold, unblinking eyes. The charges were read aloud: conspiracy to commit assault, embezzlement, fraud. "How do you plead?" the judge asked. Adrian's lawyer whispered in his ear, but Adrian barely heard him. He looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at Brendan. "Not guilty," he said, his voice barely audible. The judge set bail at $5 million. Adrian's lawyer objected, but it was denied. Adrian was led back to his cell, knowing he had no way to pay. He was going to stay in jail until the trial. Months, maybe longer. And in that moment, Adrian Voss realized the truth. He'd lost everything: his money, his reputation, his freedom, and worst of all, he'd lost the one person who'd ever truly loved him. Meanwhile, across the city, Vanessa Reed sat in her own cell, staring at the concrete walls. Her lawyer had offered her a deal: testify against Adrian, and the DA would reduce her charges from attempted murder to aggravated assault. She'd still serve time, but not as much. Vanessa had taken the deal without hesitation. She didn't owe Adrian anything. He'd used her, lied to her, abandoned her. And now, she was going to make sure he paid. When the trial began 3 months later, Vanessa took the stand and told the jury everything. How Adrian had complained about Lydia, how he'd said he wanted her gone, how he'd promised Vanessa a future if she could just convince Lydia to leave. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Vanessa said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted her to sign the papers." But she refused, and I lost control. "And did Mr. Voss know you were going to the hospital that night?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Vanessa said. "He told me to go. He said it was the only way." The defense tried to discredit her, but the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, text messages, surveillance footage. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Adrian Voss was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Vanessa Reed received 5. When the verdict was read, Brendan Tito stood in the back of the courtroom, his face expressionless. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply turned and walked out, his work complete. Justice, he thought, wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about making sure the scales were even. And now, finally, they were. 6 months after the trial, Lydia Tito stood in the nursery of her father's penthouse, watching her son sleep. His name was Ethan Brendan Tito. He was 6 months old now, healthy and strong, with his mother's dark eyes and a smile that could light up a room. The doctors had said he was a miracle, born premature, but thriving against all odds. Lydia reached into the crib and gently stroked his cheek. He stirred but didn't wake, his tiny hand curling around her finger. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "We both are." Behind her, Brendan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Lydia and stood beside her, looking down at his grandson. "He's getting big," Brendan said softly. "Too big," Lydia replied, smiling. "I can barely carry him anymore." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Ethan sleep. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, lights twinkling like stars. "How are you feeling?" Brendan asked. Lydia considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have said broken, lost, afraid. But now, "I'm healing," she said. "It's slow. Some days are harder than others, but I'm getting there." "That's all anyone can ask." Lydia turned to her father. "I never thanked you for everything you did." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You saved us, Dad. You fought for us when I couldn't fight for myself." Brendan set down his mug and took her hand. "You're my daughter, Lydia. There's nothing I wouldn't do for you. Nothing." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know, and I'm so grateful." They hugged, and for a moment the world outside didn't matter. It was just the two of them, and the tiny life sleeping peacefully in the crib. Over the following months, Lydia began to rebuild her life. She filed for divorce, and with Adrian in prison, the process was swift. The prenup was voided, and she was awarded a significant settlement, enough to ensure she and Ethan would never want for anything. But money, Lydia realized, wasn't what mattered. What mattered was purpose. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, working with survivors of domestic violence. She shared her story, not for sympathy, but to show others that they weren't alone, that there was life after trauma, that healing was possible. She also started writing. At first, it was just for herself, journal entries, fragments of memory, attempts to make sense of what had happened. But eventually, those fragments became something more. A memoir. She called it Out of the Shadows, a story of survival and strength. It was published a year later, and it became an instant bestseller. Readers wrote to her by the thousands, sharing their own stories, thanking her for her courage. Lydia read every letter, and she answered as many as she could, because she understood now that her pain had a purpose. It wasn't just something that had happened to her. It was something she could use to help others, and that, more than anything, gave her hope. One afternoon, as she sat in her father's study, reviewing the final edits of her book, Brendan knocked on the door. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always." He sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next. For you or for me. For both of us. I'm getting older, Lydia, and I've spent my whole life building this company. But lately I've been wondering, what's it all for?" Lydia set down her pen. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've made more money than I could ever spend. I've built buildings, closed deals, won battles. But at the end of the day, what does any of it matter if I'm not using it to make a difference?" "You've always made a difference, Dad." "Maybe. But I want to do more. I want to create something that lasts, something that helps people." Lydia smiled. "What did you have in mind?" Brendan pulled out a folder and handed it to her. Inside were architectural plans, financial projections, and a mission statement. "A foundation," he said, "for survivors of domestic violence. We'd provide legal support, financial assistance, counseling, and housing. Everything they need to rebuild their lives." Lydia's eyes widened. "Dad, this is incredible." "I want you to run it," Brendan said. "You've lived through this. You understand it in a way I never could. And you have the strength to lead." Lydia looked at the plans, her heart swelling. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She stood and hugged him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." "Always," Brendan replied. 6 months later, the Tito Foundation officially opened its doors. The building was beautiful, modern, welcoming, filled with light. It had offices for lawyers and counselors, apartments for women and children in need, and a community center where survivors could connect and heal. On opening day, Lydia stood at the podium looking out at the crowd. Journalists, donors, survivors, and supporters filled the room. And in the front row, holding Ethan, was Brendan, his eyes shining with pride. Lydia took a deep breath and began to speak. "A year ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, broken and afraid. I didn't know if I'd survive. I didn't know if my son would survive. But I had something that saved me. A father who refused to let me fall. A family who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. Not everyone has that. Not everyone has someone to protect them, to believe in them, to stand by them when the world feels impossible. That's why we're here. The Tito Foundation exists to be that person for those who need it, to provide safety, support, and hope. To remind survivors that they are not alone, that they are strong, that they deserve a future filled with light. Out of pain, we rise, and together, we will make sure no one has to rise alone." The room erupted in applause. Lydia smiled. her heart full. She looked down at Ethan, who was clapping his tiny hands together, and she knew with absolute certainty that everything she'd been through had led to this moment. To purpose, to heal, to hope. And for the first time in a long time, Lydia felt truly free. 5 years later, Lydia Tito stood on the balcony of the Tito Foundation's headquarters, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and rose. Ethan was 7 now, a bright, curious boy who loved books and building blocks and asking questions about everything. He was in school, thriving, surrounded by friends and teachers who adored him. He didn't remember the hospital. He didn't remember the fear, the pain, the darkness, and Lydia was grateful for that. She wanted him to grow up knowing only love, only safety, only the knowledge that he was cherished beyond measure. Behind her, the foundation buzzed with quiet activity. Counselors met with clients. Lawyers prepared cases. Children played in the community center, their laughter echoing through the halls. In the 5 years since its opening, the Tito Foundation had helped over 3,000 women and children escape abusive situations. It had provided legal representation, financial support, housing, and counseling. It had changed lives, and it had changed Lydia, too. She was no longer the fragile, frightened woman who'd lain in that hospital bed. She was strong, confident, purposeful. She'd found her voice, and she was using it to lift others. Her memoir had been adapted into a documentary, which had won several awards and sparked national conversations about domestic violence and justice. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, universities, and government hearings. She'd become an advocate, a leader, a symbol of resilience. But more than any of that, she'd become a mother, and that, she knew, was her greatest achievement. Brendan appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her and leaned against the railing, looking out at the city. "Beautiful morning," he said. "It is," Lydia agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, watching the world wake up. "I've been thinking," Brendan said after a while, "about stepping back. Retiring, maybe." Lydia looked at him in surprise. "Really?" "I'm 70 now, Lydia. I've spent my whole life working, building, fighting. But lately, I've been wondering if it's time to let someone else take the reins." "You mean me?" Brendan smiled. "You're already running the foundation, and you're doing a better job than I ever could. But I was thinking, maybe it's time to expand, to take everything we've built here and replicate it in other cities, other countries." Lydia's eyes widened. "That's a huge undertaking." "It is. But I think you're ready, and I think the world needs it." Lydia considered his words. 5 years ago, she would have been terrified by the idea. But now she felt ready. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." Brendan grinned. "That's my girl." They clinked their coffee cups together, a quiet toast to the future. Later that day, Lydia picked Ethan up from school. He ran to her, his backpack bouncing, his face lit with excitement. "Mom! Mom! Guess what?" "What, sweetheart?" "We learned about heroes today, and I told everyone that you're my hero." Lydia's heart swelled. She knelt down and hugged him tight. "You're my hero too, Ethan." "Really?" "Really. You're brave and kind and smart, and I'm so proud of you." Ethan beamed. "Can we get ice cream?" Lydia laughed. "Absolutely." They walked hand in hand to the ice cream shop, talking about his day, his friends, his dreams. And as they sat on a bench, eating their cones and watching the world go by, Lydia felt a deep, abiding peace. She thought about Adrian, locked away in prison, paying for his crimes. She thought about Vanessa, serving her sentence, hopefully finding some measure of redemption. She didn't hate them anymore. She didn't even think about them most days. Because hate, she'd learned, was a weight she didn't need to carry. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing. It meant letting go, moving forward, choosing light over darkness, and that was exactly what she'd done. That evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Do you think I'll be a hero when I grow up?" Lydia smiled and kissed his forehead. "I think you already are." Ethan smiled and closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep. Lydia stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. Then she turned off the light and walked down the hall, where Brendan was waiting. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's perfect," Lydia said. And it was, because out of pain they had risen. Out of darkness they had found light, and out of brokenness they had built something beautiful, a legacy of hope, a foundation of strength, a future filled with promise. And as the city lights twinkled outside the window, Lydia knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, unbroken, free.